We are in the store today, and that's because we're here on a mission. Now, I know you probably all know that we sell a little bit of everything. Some of that stuff is computer parts, that's right. Now, I love to build computers, especially, just as a hobby. It's a great way to spend the day. I think it's amazing, the satisfaction of building your own computer, especially gaming PCs. Now, I have friends who've asked me, Doug, can you build me a computer? And I'm like, yes, of course I'm gonna build you a computer, but please, don't ask me in the comments to build you a computer because I'm about to do the next best thing. I'm gonna show you how to build your own gaming PC using parts you can find here at B&H. Whoa, looky here. We got everything already selected. I didn't even have to make any choices. Well, of course I did, behind the scenes. I want you to know one thing before we begin. Everything you see here, we're gonna talk about everything in detail, but these are suggestions. These are things that you can buy to fulfill your needs, but really, no matter what it is, whether it's the CPU, GPU, the drives, everything, you have to make your own considerations and think about what you want to do versus how much you're willing to spend. And it's not an easy decision to make, I'll admit that, but that's part of the fun. So let's get started. So with that said, you're gonna want a couple of tools. You don't need that much to build a computer. Some screwdrivers and a plier. Most things can just be built with a standard Phillips head screwdriver, and of course some pliers in case you need to get into tight spaces, or if you drop something like a screw, you can pull it right out. Also, a light. So we're gonna skip most unboxing for this video, but I'm gonna do one unboxing, and that is for our motherboard. The reason being is that I wanna tell you something. You should read every single manual. It comes in an anti-static bag. We'll take that out and we'll put it aside for now. Keep that bag because we're gonna use that throughout the video. So now in the box, if you take this out, you have some cables, there's a manual, CD even, if you use those still, and also a bracket for the connectors in the back of the case. Hold on to this. Most of what's in here we're going to get back to, but if you need to refer to a manual, please do it. I'm going to do most of the work here on the anti-static bag, at least in the beginning, because it's anti-static. So I'm just gonna take the board out, lay it flat. One more thing I wanna bring out is the CPU tray. Now this is not something you're gonna find in stores. This is unique for OEM manufacturers. We're gonna take that out. Now you can see, this is cool. They normally have a ton of CPUs just sitting in here, but of course we only need one. This is it right here. This is how tiny the modern day CPU is. Now a CPU is considered by many to be the brains of a computer, and though that's not wrong, it's a little simplistic in my opinion. A CPU is the single most important factor when buying a computer. You need to consider what you're doing, your budget obviously, and if you want to do things aside from your main function. So for example, if you're gaming, which is exactly what we plan to do you want to stream your games? Do you want to run music or videos in the background as you play? So in this case, we're using the Intel Core i7 9700KF. It's running at 3.6 gigahertz, and it is an 8-core processor. A lot of people don't really understand what multiple cores enable them to do, what it means for them. Having a multi-core processor means you can essentially do more things at once, but it also means, depending on the program, that it might be able to work in parallel. Games used to be more favorable towards single-core processing and later dual and quad-core, but these days we are seeing a lot more games that are taking advantage of 6 to 8-core processors. And there's reasons for that that have to do with gaming consoles, but it goes beyond the scope of this video. So the safest rule is that these days, it's probably a safe bet if you're looking to game on AAA titles that you're gonna want a 6 or 8 core processor. Now when it comes to clock speed, things are not as simple as they used to be. They've gotten a bit trickier over the years. It used to be that clock speed, as long as it went up, you pretty much had a faster processor. It was guaranteed. Now, a higher number does still mean a faster processor, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're gonna get a ton more performance. And also, the same number a few years back is probably going to be a slower processor. This processor runs at 3.6 gigahertz, but most processors have been running in the 3 gigahertz range for well over a decade now, and I guarantee you that they're not as fast as this one. Now, one more note about the CPU. This is the KF line, which means that it actually lacks an integrated graphics card. Most of Intel's processors do have integrated graphics, and we really don't need it here. It's not a problem if you're building a gaming PC, because most gamers are gonna buy a dedicated graphics card. But you do lose some benefits if you don't have that. You lose things like Intel hardware video encoding. You lose things like the ability to run your computer without a graphics card, which in emergencies can be helpful. So just bear that in mind. All right, so let's talk about the motherboard. You cannot buy a motherboard or even think about a motherboard without choosing your CPU first, so now we're over here. This is the Asus Prime Z390A. Now, the number in there is not just a fancy model number, it actually refers to something very important. There's two things you need to look for when buying a motherboard. The socket type, which is 1151, and the chipset. The chipset in this case being the Z390. Now that's something that controls things like your SATA connections, your USB slots. This chipset is aimed a little more at the high end. There are more budget-friendly options out there, and they come in many varieties on countless other boards. I can't begin to tell you how many. Now, if that's confusing to you, I understand, but we've made it actually pretty easy. If you go on the B&H website and you limit your search for motherboards based on the socket type and the CPU type, you can very easily find motherboards that only work for that CPU. So if you're wondering why we chose this motherboard to begin with, it's because it has a vast array of connections in the back, very nicely built, clean layout, and of course it has two NVMe ports, which we'll get to later. All right, so first things first, on the motherboard here, you see that there is a plastic cover right over where the CPU will go, and there's a nice metal latch here. Very simply just push down, pull it out a little bit. This will all come up. We take that plastic out, we leave that aside. So let's grab the CPU. If you look at the top here, you can see that there's these two notches, one on each side. And that helps you know how to correctly orient the CPU into the socket. So we're gonna place it around. Again, here are the notches. They go over here, and if you just delicately place the CPU and it will sit flush. Close the tray and bring the lock back down. It requires a bit of pressure, and that's it. That's all it takes to install a CPU. Okay, so next up is memory, or RAM, random access memory. We have here a 32 gigabyte kit. I highly recommend you buy RAM in kits of 2 because usually they're matched pairs, which gets you dual channel memory. You can add memory afterwards, but it's ideal that you just start from a matched pair. It just makes things way easier. So if you're wondering about RAM speed and quantity, here's the thing. Yes, you can get very fast RAM. This is DDR4 3200 megahertz, which is reasonably fast, not the fastest. But if you have a choice between more RAM and faster RAM, I personally would always get more RAM. It's much more important to just have enough of it. I wouldn't say that you can never have enough, but it's always more important, especially if you're dealing with graphical or processor-heavy applications. They love memory. Gaming is usually okay when you're up to about 16. You really don't need much more than that in most cases, but why not? Let's go 32. Now RAM's pretty easy. It's hard to mess up, but it's also easy to mess up if you do things the wrong way. Basically, there's one thing you gotta look out for. You got a notch in the bottom here. The entire pin arrangement is asymmetrical. So you'll notice there's slightly fewer pins on the left side here than on the right. Now, all you have to do, there's these latches on the side of the slot for the RAM. These are called DIMMs, by the way, if you ever see them referred to that way. You just slide them in the top, they should fall right into place, and the notch will line up with a corresponding notch in the slot. So this just requires a little bit of force to slide down. Make sure it lines up before you press any further. This will start, as you press, this will start to go in, and it locks on its own. So now, these are dual channel sticks, which means that the memory works in tandem, but to take advantage of that, you need to insert them in the right order. You'll see here that we have 4 slots. Now you might think that the next DIMM goes into the slot right next to it, but it doesn't. If you look carefully, and this isn't always on the motherboards, but it's more common these days, if you look, you'll see that some of these have a gray shade and some of them are black. We inserted the first DIMM into a black slot. You can't see it from here, but on the board itself, it literally reads DIMM B1. We're gonna match that with A1, which is this third slot here. This changes from board to board, which is why it's important to read the board or read the manual in case you're confused. So again, we'll go here. I've already unlocked this. This is the third slot, or DIMM A1, and we will just press it in. Locks on both sides. Again, you do need some force, but be very careful. All right, so we've got the RAM and the CPU installed. Now it's time finally to place the board into a case. So what do we have here? Well, I've already unpacked it, but this is the NZXT-H510. Now this is what's known as a standard mid-tower ATX case. ATX is a form factor. It is a type of case, and most computers fall under it. There's also other types of cases, such as micro ATX cases, which are a little bit smaller, and mini ITX cases, which are even smaller than that. You should get a motherboard that matches your form factors. So in this case, we went for an ATX motherboard because it offers the most connections. Okay, so don't mind the set. You know, this is a process. I got my camera guy Matt here. We're gonna show you this in real time, so bear with me. Before you go and just put the motherboard in, please don't forget something. Let me show you this. So I can't tell you how many times I've forgotten about this. This is basically a back end plate for the input output ports. And while you don't necessarily need it, if you forget to include it, it's a pain to have to take your entire board out and put it back in afterwards. So all you have to do is literally just press it inside the case, and it should just, it'll go. There we go. So let's put the board in. Make sure not to grab it by anything that's very fragile. Usually the heat sinks are a good place to grab it. You don't want to hold any of the connectors if possible. Sometimes you may have to just to angle it a certain way, but try not to. So you can see here there's these holes for screws throughout the board. There's some in the middle as well. You're not going to necessarily use each one of these depending on the corresponding layout of the case, but most of these will fit. You're going to slide it in, let it lay flat. Now if you do it right, it should hit up against the frame that you put in the back here. You can see it here, it pops into place. What you're gonna be doing is screwing the board down. So these are your case screws. We're gonna open that up and take a few out. Now this is really cool because of all the extra space in here. I can just pop my little on-camera light directly in the case. That's beautiful. So you'll see there's this one peg that kind of holds the board in place. That's not really secure, but it does guide you. So grab your screwdriver, one of the screws that comes with the case, they all do. And I'm gonna start in the corner just to get things locked into place a bit. I'm gonna guide that screw in there. There we go. And now just press down enough so that you're definitely threading into the stand that is on the case. So let's balance things out. I'm gonna go to the opposite side, right over here. It should pull into place as you do it. And we're just gonna keep doing this throughout the case. I'll go in alternating fashion just to make sure that the tension is equal across the board. So that board is going nowhere. Great. All right, next up is the power supply. So I'm gonna actually rotate this up, and I've already taken out, I've already taken out the back side of the case, which makes it easier to access these cables. So we have here the EVGA 850B3 power supply. This is obviously by the number 850 watts, which to some people may be overkill. It does give you a lot of headroom though for powering your computer if you start to put a ton of drives or multiple GPUs, for example, which is absolutely an option. Highly recommend you get a modular power supply if possible. You don't need it though. Now, one thing you do need to know though is this little thing called the 80+, in this case, bronze rating. There's also silver and gold. That refers to the efficiency rating of the power supply. So you ideally want to get one that has that. So we're going to just slide that in there. And now it does actually come with, here we go, it comes with screws. And now this is a standard layout too. This is all part of ATX. So all you have to do is affix the screws to the four corners of the power supply. So again, just hold it up slightly until you get it into place. So cabling, getting the power cables in order, and especially all the connections for the power button, the external connections, LED indicators. It's kind of tricky because there's a lot of small connectors that you have to deal with. So this is where the pliers come in handy. First, let's look at the back. So what we have here is we have an audio connection. This is for USB over here. I believe this is another USB. This is possibly for the USB-C. And then we have this one, front panel. So you want to snake these through, and I'm just going to hold them from the other side. When I tilt over, you'll see. We'll get all these over. There's a slot here. now I have the cables out through the front. So this little slot here is just where the cables came through, and what we're really gonna try to do is deal with these various pin arrangements here. So we're gonna start with the front panel. Now, in a lot of cases, this connector here is actually broken out into several very small 2-pin connectors. You can see here it's all in one block. That kind of saves me a lot of trouble, but ironically enough, there's also, let me hold it side by side, there's also this other grouping connector, I guess you could call it, that came with the board, with the motherboard. And that was supposed to simplify it for me. So the case has already kind of done half the work. Now you're probably wondering, there's more pins here than here. Well, this covers for a speaker as well, a PC speaker, which I don't even remember the last time I ever used one of those, so we're gonna ignore those. I'm gonna put the light in there so you can see. We have a blocked out pin here. So we really wanna try to match that arrangement to this. Now you can see in the middle here, might be hard to see, I'll angle a few times, there's a missing pin here. So we're gonna arrange this, we're gonna match that, and we're just gonna connect it like that. Let me see, is it going in? Okay, there we go. All right, we got it connected. It just took a little bit of force to do. And you know, this keeps these pins away so you don't have to worry about them breaking the circuit or anything like that. So now this can go right over here. It might be hard to see. I'm gonna put some images in this video so it's easier to see, close-ups of the diagram on the motherboard. Generally, these are all labeled these days, but the print is very small. So I can see here, it's upside down for me, but I can see here that the pin arrangement has a blank pin in the middle. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna grab my pliers and just kind of hold this, which allows me to very nicely articulate it. And I will guide it over the pins here. These are your front panel connections. Again, you can consult your manual to find out exactly how they line up, but the easiest is to just look at the missing pin on the middle here. It corresponds on the bottom. Now, I discovered something when I was test fitting this, that one of these pins is not used. So you can see here, I've kind of placed it over, and there's a missing set of pins right here. Well, not pins missing, but there's no connection for it. That's totally fine. Some cases have different arrangements. As long as you don't have them connected the wrong way, nothing's gonna happen. This will just go unused. Okay, so now we have these other cables here, right? This is USB. Generally speaking, I put the light down, we have a connector right here that is for USB 3. So that goes in. Keep in mind that there's a notch right here. This I will do with my hands just because it's got a nice fat connector, and I'll plug that right in. It's got a nice snap. We have here, this is USB 3.2 presumably. Now it looks like the header for that is actually in the middle of the board towards the side. So that means that I have to rearrange the cabling a little bit. That's totally fine. This happens all the time. So while we're here though, let's just take care of the HD audio, which is just a generic term. This is for the motherboard's built-in audio set. You have connections on the back if you want to connect speakers, but let's say you want to have headphones. The connectors on the top need to go into the motherboard here. That's why we're setting all this up, remember. So again, missing pin towards the end. I'm gonna flip it around. Now the arrangement over here, it's called AAFP, which that's actually new to me. I've never seen that one before. Usually you see HD audio on the board itself to indicate that that's the connection. Again, consult the manual if you're not sure. I'm just gonna put it over here and it should fit right on. And it does. Cool. And then I'm just gonna tuck the cable in a little just to get a cleaner arrangement. Okay, so I've rerouted the cable through the side here, so much closer to the header. And let's just see how this sits in. Good. Perfect. So we're just gonna sit that in and we'll tuck the rest underneath. Okay, so we're done with the connections to the front panels. We're gonna do the power connections now. I'm gonna go back and forth as I do it because after all, it's a modular power supply. If you don't have a modular power supply, you're going to be fighting and wrestling with unnecessary cables or even necessary cables, but you're going to be fighting with them as you try to position parts inside the case. Okay, so looking back down here, we have the empty connections on the power supply. And now what we can do with that is take this long cable here. This is the motherboard connection. You can see it clearly says MB. We have these split ends, and that matches the split connection on the power supply itself. So we're just gonna go in there. You can see there's a little notch here. Go in there and we will push it in. You'll hear a nice, satisfying snap. We got the other one in there. So now we have the other side of the cable, and we're gonna route that up the side here, kind of where the USB connection was before, because I know that the motherboard power connection is usually around here. So I'm just gonna loop this through, making sure not to pull anything too much. We kind of want to just keep things neat from the get-go. Let's flip this over. So this is the motherboard power. We have the cable here. If you see here, there are these almost like diamond or kind of triangular shaped pins next to square shaped pins. There's also a missing one right there. And of course, a latch on the side. So the diamond shaped ones obviously have a smaller side to them. So you're gonna kind of look for the matching side on the connection. So this one's pretty easy to figure out, even though it looks kind of intimidating. So you're gonna turn this around. It's gonna be a little contorted. It's a thick cable, so it might take a bit of force to push. It should rest right in, and then of course just push it in. There's a few more power connections. There's another CPU power connection here. I'm just gonna walk you through one fan to show you how easy it is and how intuitive it is to read the board and to read the manual in case you're lost. So this is the same thing as the earlier connections from the USB headers. These just have to go through, and we can, let's see, where can we put these? These can probably come up actually from the backside. When it comes to fans on these, you have a bunch of options on boards these days. You can see that there is a chassis fan here, CHA fan 1. There's another one for the CPU fan here. There's another chassis fan option over here. You have a few options to power these things. So these are standard 3-pin cables in this case. So we're gonna pull it over. So I did a few things in that time lapse. I've looped around the fan power connections. These were previously affixed to the case, and I also installed a CPU power cable. This is very similar to the motherboard. It's smaller, of course, but it is something that you need. So I've already looped them into the front side here, which means we're just able to attach them. I'm going to bring this cable up the front. Again, this is more of a tidiness thing. Let's see here, is this long enough? This is the fun, I gotta reroute this. Okay, let's see if this works now. Take 3, I think, maybe 4. We have our fan cables, we're gonna put those aside for a sec. Let's look at these CPU connectors. So now these are very similar to the motherboard connectors, the EATX 12 volt. So these are the 12 volt rails. I'll probably need my pliers to do this because it is a bit of a tight squeeze. I'm gonna try to do this with just pliers, so bear with me. I probably need fingers, actually. Okay. Sometimes this happens. Sometimes you realize you gotta just follow the rules. We're gonna take the fan out and do it that way. So after a little bit of trial and error, I initially brought the CPU cable up here, and it was not quite right. Something was wrong with the pin arrangement. I was looking at these and they didn't quite line up. Turns out that they also gave this, which is another conjoined CPU attachment that then goes here on the female end to those connections there. So I'm going to attach them, and hopefully that works by going straight into the board. So that, as you can see, it even lines up in the middle. The dual latch kind of fits over there. Now we have a little more slack, so what I can actually do is connect this and simultaneously push back some of the slack. I've taken the fan out, as you know, and I'm just going to use one of these. You shouldn't need 2 for most cases. There are some CPUs that do require it, but either of these will work for you. So we'll turn over here, and boom, fits right in. What I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna tuck that power cable there. It doesn't seem to fit well behind this. I'll do that, reattach the fan, and we'll be good to go. Okay, so I spared you the additional pain of watching me wrestle with cables as I predicted would happen. So let's start with storage. We're gonna go with solid state the whole way. We're gonna keep things moving fast. So these are the Intel SSD 6 series. Now these are very nice, high performing solid state drives. We have 2 of them today. They're each a terabyte. We're not gonna have a traditional hard drive in this setup for that reason, because we have the 2. I cannot tell you how fast these are compared to a traditional hard drive. Solid state drives in general, regardless of the type you get, are dramatic improvements to any computer. They are probably the single biggest advancement in terms of how smooth and how fast computers feel in the last 15 years or so. There are multiple types of ways to connect drives. You have the traditional SATA connection, which you can still get for both regular hard drives and, of course, solid-state drives. These are what's known as NVMe drives, and the connector here is called an M2, so this is an M2 key. So you just need to make sure that your board supports that. Most of them these days do. It's not really hard to find anymore. These are becoming more and more common these days, so you'll have no problem finding them. They cost a little bit more, but they're dramatically faster, and these are great for video editing, especially if you're into that, which you might be if you're watching this channel. So a few things before we begin. These tiny stands. I'll put them over here so you can kind of see them in my hand. So now these are the screws for the NVMe drive. The one over here is actually a stand for the drive to rest on, and then that screws it into place. So first, before we install the drive, we're gonna put the stand on. It'll go out there. This is where it's going to screw in. So I know that we're using this stand here. I'm just gonna put the stand on. Grab the SSD, again, very small. This kind of works like RAM. It has a very similar pin arrangement. You just go in, and that's it. Now this is normal. Rising up like that's totally normal. All you have to do is grab that very tiny screw, just lightly press down here, and then guide the screw in very carefully. This is very small, so don't be surprised if you slip. And then we just lock that in. I'm gonna install another one and then we'll move on. Okay, we can finally start putting in some cards. How about that? So now the motherboard we bought doesn't have Wi-Fi built in. You can find motherboards that have built-in Wi-Fi, but it does limit your choices somewhat. There's way more options that don't have it built in, so we went without just because that was what was available. But we need Wi-Fi, so we're gonna pop in a Wi-Fi adapter PCIe card. Now, just in case you're wondering what that is in general, this is a PCIe card. Your graphics card that we're gonna be putting in is essentially a PCIe card as well. Now this is a small connector. It's a ×1 PCIe. These are essentially for low demand things like adapters or peripherals that may not necessarily need all the bandwidth of the full connection. You can also get USB Wi-Fi adapters, but in general, I've had way more luck with these types. So now before I pop this in, the first thing I'm gonna do, let's set it down. It has its own anti-static bag. We're gonna look at the backside here, and you can just follow along from the front. So now you see these over here? These can pop out individually. On some other cases, unfortunately, that change is permanent. Luckily, this is a good case. On any decent case, you'll be able to unscrew these and replace them if need be. So we're just gonna take one out. Now I determined which one it is already by just lightly test fitting this, where I'm gonna put it, and it is gonna be this slot right here. And I'll show you when we get back around why I chose that. Keep these, because you never really know, you might want to take a card out at some point, and then you don't want dust getting into your system. Try not to lose these. All right, so we're about to install the card. I failed to mention that this back plate that goes right over the expansion cards was in the way, so I've just removed that. We're going to install it into this small PCI one-time slot. All of these over here are PCIe slots. And technically, you can put this, even though it's this many pins, you can put this into a 16-time slot and it will work, but it's kind of wasteful. The graphics card is actually gonna consume 3 slots. It's huge. That is the reason why I chose this slot. Now, this is very important. The metal tip here has to go inside the case, cannot go outside the case. So you'll see it seats very lightly there, and then you just push it right in. Make sure it sits fine before you push it in, because again, this lip needs to be inside the case, not outside the case. Now this top flap is going to rest where that metal piece that we took out before is, and that means you can just use that screw that you took out and screw this onto the case. So we're gonna do that right now. Put a little pressure on the metals so it sticks in place, and then that should not move. And of course there are antennas to put on here. That is your Wi-Fi. Pretty cool, right? We recommend preparatory mounting of the cooler outside the PC case for subsequent installation. Oh my God, okay. I messed up, but it happens. Here's what's going on. We're using a custom cooling solution. This is the Be Quiet Dark Rock 4. Now that's required because the Intel processor we're using is on an enthusiast end, which means that they don't usually pair them with stock coolers. On most CPUs, they have stock coolers and you can very easily just attach them right to the motherboard. This one actually requires you to buy your own. Just so you know, your cooler will probably be different than the one we're using. Here it is right here. This is massive. I love this. But I should have read the manual. Oh well. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make some of the adjustments myself. Behind the scenes, I'll get the fan kind of set up and then I'll show you what needs to be done just to fix it into place. And of course, thermal paste placement, which we'll get to. So meet me in a few minutes. All right, so we are finally ready to put the fan in. So let me just explain a little bit about what we did to prepare for it. So these mounting brackets here are custom installed. These come with the fan. They do not come with the CPU or the motherboard. In most cases, like I was saying before, if you have a thing that uses stock setup, so a CPU that supports a stock fan, you'll usually see mounting brackets already installed. They look different than this usually. All right, let's put this in. So the first thing we're gonna do is look at this right here. This is thermal paste. Let me show you in the close-up camera here. Now this is just a paste that transfers heat and increases conductivity between the surface of the CPU and the bottom of the heatsink. So that transfers that heat up. It just helps eliminate any gaps whatsoever. Now the general rule is that you want to apply a very small amount, a pea-sized drop is what I've always heard, in dead center of the CPU. Now before I do that, I'm actually going to be prudent here and clean the surface of the CPU. It's always important. Grab some rubbing alcohol or an alcohol wipe, which is what we're using here, and just clean the surfaces of the CPU and of course the heatsink itself. You never know what might be on it, especially adhesives. There was a sticker on this before. We're gonna make sure that dries out. So just give that a few moments. We're gonna take the thermal paste and apply a very small amount to the center, trying not to get it around as we do it. Again, you want a pea-sized drop. So we're gonna put that on there and just let it kind of collect for a little bit. We don't want too much, but we also don't want too little. And that is looking pretty good. Let's grab our hefty heatsink here, and we just take this mounting block here, and I'm careful not to touch the bottom. I don't want my grease all over that. We're gonna let that sit there. And oh, actually, before we do it, we're gonna attach the power. There's a little header here. I'll try to show you. If not, I'll show an image in the video. That's the CPU fan header. And that's similar to the case fans from before. We're just gonna attach this right in there before we attach everything, or else it's gonna just be hard for us to move our hands around. And I'm going to now rest this on top of the CPU. And the idea here is that the pressure of the heatsink will spread the paste out. So you're not smearing it yourself, you're not distributing it in any way, you're just using the pressure and the weight of the heatsink to disperse it. So I'm just gonna gently lay it down, just applying some pressure to make sure it spreads around. And then let's just make sure that the fan clears the RAM. It looks like it does, just barely, which is great. Gotta line it up with the brackets. Now the only problem here that I'm facing is it's hard for me to actually screw this in, because the RAM is blocking the way and even the fan's blocking the way. So what I'll probably have to do is screw in one side, remove the RAM, possibly even the fan, and then finally get it all put together. So bear with me. So all I had to do is take the fan itself off. I didn't have to take the ram out, luckily. I was able to just screw this back in. The fan fell off, so I had to then rig it back in, and it's a thing. So just know that custom fans are very annoying. We'll be back tomorrow, because we took the entire day to shoot this video. I'll be back tomorrow to put in the graphics card. Yes. All right, see you soon. Bye-bye, folks. So we're gonna jump right into it today, the thing that all of you have been waiting for, I'm sure. This is the graphics card, or the GPU, as most people like to call it. Now this is the NVIDIA GeForce RTX 2080 Super. It is one of the highest end graphics cards you can get right now. I don't know if there's many options above it, but that begs the question. I'm sure you're all wondering, how do I choose a graphics card and what goes into that decision? Well, there's a few things. Now, obviously you want to have good performance in your games. You want high resolutions, high frame rates, all of the bells and whistles, but it's not just about that, at least not anymore. You know, if you're into productivity, for example, along with gaming, you're gonna wanna consider the options that best affect your software. For example, if you use the Adobe Creative Suite, I know the NVIDIA cards tend to work very well with that. Also, if you like to stream your games, there's hardware video encoding on most graphics cards these days that you can take advantage of, and it releases the burden on the CPU. So that's just more resources you have to game with. But also, graphics cards impact things like how many displays you can run, how high of a resolution you can use on those displays, and even the standards that you use on the connections. So you have to really consider what your needs are. If you want to ensure that you support things like HDR or variable refresh rates, you have to make sure that that's a thing your card supports. Now in this case, we went for the high-end because it's just nice to demo a high-end card. I'm not gonna lie. Personally, I find that the best bang for the buck is somewhere in the mid to high-end range. Not quite the top end, because after all, today's top-end tech usually becomes tomorrow's mid-range. And I find that you have to upgrade anyway. So it makes the most sense for most people to stick in that mid to high tier. So now before we put the card inside, we do have to talk a little bit about choices. You have countless choices when it comes to graphics cards, and it can be a little confusing if you don't know what to look for first. And I'm not just talking about spec, I'm just talking about numbers and brands. After all, you're probably confused over why it says EVGA here, even though it's an NVIDIA card. Well, it basically works like this. NVIDIA, in this case, makes the chip itself, and the chip is the 2080 Super. That goes onto a PCB, which is the board that resides in the computer, and that is manufactured by EVGA. So other manufacturers essentially produce the card that the chip lies on. And they also often produce the cooling systems and decide which connections they're gonna put on the back. Now that's where the variety comes in. So that means that even for this card alone, the 2080 Super, just for EVGA, you probably have 4 or 5 different options that all have different cooling solutions. And they're really not too different in terms of performance. You might have some slightly higher clock speeds on one versus the other, but in general, they're very comparable. What you're really looking for is size, dimensions, fans, cooling, and possibly clock speed. So what do I expect to get out of this? Well, I expect to run most modern games at high to ultra settings. I'd be a little disappointed if I couldn't, and not to mention the fact that we're not going to be running this system at 4K because the screen we have is not a 4K screen. However, it is a 144 Hz screen, so I expect high frame rates. So one thing you want to be sure about when you're choosing your GPU is that you don't pair it with a weak CPU. Now, a lot of people might say that you can save some money on the CPU and put that more into the GPU, and that is largely correct. You don't want to get a workstation class CPU and then have no money left over for your graphics card. It doesn't make sense, especially in this case. But you also don't want to have a budget CPU that can't issue commands fast enough to the GPU. Basically, it can't communicate as fast as the GPU can. You might see people online refer to this as bottlenecking, and that's something we're trying to avoid. Oh, and one final note, because a somewhat disturbing trend has started that I guess we'll have to live with. This card takes up 3 slots. And luckily I knew that going into this, but it does mean that I had to be very careful about my board choice and how much space I made in the case. Sometimes the graphics cards are actually so long that they won't fit into the case, or they'll budge up against all the cabling that you have in there. Luckily, we don't have to worry about that here. It's a behemoth. Wow. Okay. Yeah, 3 slots. It'll fit though, I hope. Let's not mess up again. Okay, so I've gone ahead and taken care of some things just so we don't have to go through every single step. As you can see here, I've taken the metal slats out from the back just so we know where the card's gonna sit. I've test fitted it so we know exactly which ones. I've also run through a power cable from the modular power supply, and just so you know, in this case, they're very clearly labeled as VGA. VGA here. Now the reason you can see this in the close-up, there's 2 connectors here. They kind of splinter off. Not all of them are designed this way, by the way. A lot of power supplies will give you 2 separate ones. Some will conjoin them like this. In this case, it's very nice. It's just 1 wire going back out to the power supply. And then these are exclusively for PCIe power. In this case, you can see here on the graphics card, there are 2 connectors to supply additional power. The card does not sufficiently run off of just the slot itself, the PCIe slot. This just requires way too much juice for that, which is why those cables are needed. So I'm gonna go ahead and put the card in. I've already taken the rubber seals off of the connectors, and we're using this large PCIe 16 times slot here. You'll notice there's a few of these. There's 3 of them in this board. This is for multiple graphics cards if you decide to go down that road. I'm not personally a fan of doing that because there are some instabilities, and also a lot of games just don't support it, and it's expensive. Let's go ahead and just lightly, delicately place the card in. Again, you don't want to force it in, you just want to let it sit on the slot. Make sure that the paneling on the front goes inside the case, not outside, and then it looks like it's good. We're gonna push it in, it'll make a light snap. It should lock in actually. There's a lock on the 16 times slots. So you'll notice this kind of sags a little bit, but this does take up 3 slots, so we have 3 times as many screws to secure it with. So I'm just gonna do that right now, real quickly. I'm gonna secure it first. And again, just pull lightly on this as you're doing it so that you put it into the correct position. All right, and that's looking good. So the card should be pretty stable in there now, perfect. All right, so now we have this cable here, right? So you're gonna require slightly different versions of this. You can see there's another little part that comes off on the side. These both can either operate as 6-pin cables or as 8-pin cables. And now some cards will actually require 2 8-pin cables. That's a lot of power. This one's not quite there. So we can get by with 1 8-pin arrangement, which is just the 6 with this little additional connector here. And then I can just make sure the pins line up and put it right in. And then same for here, except I don't need the extra 2 pins. I'm just gonna put those in. They have the same arrangement, so I'm just gonna put it in like that. And then, you know, I'll just tuck the cable back. So that's it. That is actually the whole build. We've put every single part that we've got for this into the computer. It's really not much when you know what you're doing. So we're gonna close this up, make sure everything's nice and tidy, and set up the monitor and peripherals. All right, I'll meet you back in a few minutes. Oh. Yeah. Beautiful, right? Nice and clean. There is nothing quite like turning on a computer for the first time, and I'm gonna grant you the pleasure of watching me do that. Oh, does it work? Does it work? Looks like it's booting up. So now let's actually do something real quick before we talk further. So what I just did was I hit the delete key rapidly. There's other options, the F2 key. What you're doing, or what we're doing right here, is we're entering something called the BIOS. Now the BIOS is essentially, you can think of it as almost like a very basic operating system that happens at the very first stages of the computer's boot up process. Every computer has this, but you can access it usually by hitting delete or F2, and there's a reason we're doing this. For one, We're doing it to just check and make sure everything's working. We can see our operating temperatures are nice. We have 28°C in the motherboard, 32 in the CPU. Those are very great temperatures. The fans are all running and they're being monitored. But the main reason we're here is to change something called the boot order. Now, right now, we don't have an operating system. Nothing's been installed. This is a completely fresh, empty system. So we have to put an operating system. Now, we're gaming, so we're probably gonna go with Windows. In this case, I'm going to install it off of a USB drive. You can still buy physical DVD copies of Windows, if anybody wants to do that. But if you're fancy like me, you'll make your own USB drive with the installer built in. Now, to do that, you do need another computer. You can do it very easily using Microsoft's own tool on a PC, or if you're fancy, you can do it even on a Mac using Terminal. So what you're looking for is boot priority. Now, every BIOS looks different depending on the manufacturer, so you might not recognize all of this. You're looking for something called boot priority or boot order. Now, right here on the first page, we can see that there's a section just for boot priority. You might have to go digging around for this. There's a shortcut as well, boot menu. Right here, what you're looking at is a recognized USB thumb drive that I've already put in the back. Now, just a small mention, I don't recommend you put USB drives in first boot on these top or external ports for the case, because for some reason they do tend to sometimes throw trouble with the boot sequence. I prefer to use the built-in USB ports on the motherboard, so the drive's in the back. So I'm just gonna click this, and that just makes the USB drive our first priority for booting. And what that allows us to do is install Windows right off of the USB drive. Later, when we're done installing, we're gonna change the boot order to make the solid state drive first. That way, we boot right there before we hit the USB drive. All right, following along, let's go. So this is already selected. We're just gonna save and exit. There are no other changes to be made. We'll hit OK and the computer will reboot. You'll see a little wheel, there it is, come up. And we go right to the installation. Now I'm just gonna breeze through this real quickly. Okay, so it's going on its own. Windows generally takes about 15 to 20 minutes to install, so we'll be back in a few minutes. As long as you have an internet connection, it'll download most of your drivers for you, and then we'll do some updates once we get into the OS. Hey, so that's only about 10 minutes and we're already into Windows. That's pretty cool. So that means that things are working fast. It was reading off of a flash drive and installing onto a solid state NVMe drive. So we're dealing with some of the fastest things you can get. So every time you install a new system, you're gonna wanna install the latest updates because oftentimes hardware ships with out-of-date drivers. Even if you install drivers off of CDs, which some things do still come with, they're gonna probably be out of date, and you can almost certainly find better choices if you go to the manufacturer's website. That said, Windows Update does take care of most of the drivers for your computer. The one exception I would make is probably your Wi-Fi adapter and the graphics card. You should almost always go straight to the vendor, in this case NVIDIA, for your graphics driver and get the latest version that you can. So now, before we finish up, let's just talk a little bit about peripherals here. The monitor, which is a little bit more than a peripheral, this is an LG 27-inch monitor. It is the 27GL850B. And this is a wonderful display. This is a gaming-oriented display. You can kind of clearly see the NVIDIA G-Sync logo. This is a FreeSync and G-Sync compatible display, and what that means is that you have variable refresh rate compatibility for your games. So they're constantly going to appear smooth even if your frame rate fluctuates a bit. It's a great feature in modern gaming. I'm glad to see this become a standard, and so we figured why not? Let's throw it in here. It's also a 1440p display, so not a 4K display, not a 1080p display, somewhere in the middle. I like that resolution actually because it's not too demanding on the graphics card, and it still has an edge over 1080p, but you can push the frame rate quite a bit. And it's an HDR IPS display, so while it doesn't get the brightest, it is compatible with HDR material, and an IPS display means it's going to have very accurate color representation. So now for the keyboard, we're looking at a Logitech G413 mechanical keyboard. I love mechanical keyboards. They have such a nice tactile feel. Unfortunately, this one's a little quiet for my tastes, but we'll let that slide. And I must admit, I forgot to buy a mouse. We just connected a generic Microsoft USB mouse. Really, I'm not a stickler for gaming mice, although I know some people do love them. They love the macro commands on them. I have some at home, but you know what? If you have any idea, if you want to recommend some, please let us know in the comments below. And if you want to see more videos like this, because please, I want to make more videos like this, please let us also know in the comments below. I'm Doug with B&H, and I'll see you next time.